The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, I want to focus my comments on this debate about the need for structural change in the Intelligence and Security Committee rather than narrowly on the personality and membership composition of it, because I think the former is the most important. But I do want to say this first. The decision that was made by Andrew Little to nominate David Shearer for this committee wasn't based on a negative reflection on the Greens or New Zealand First or anybody else. It was based on a positive assessment of the skills and the experience that David Shearer brings to this job. I know better than most, but I think the members that I'm referring to now also recognise that over a 20-year period, David has experience that has not previously been seen in this House in terms of the places that he worked and the way that he needed to conduct himself and the understanding that he developed in places like Kosovo, in Somalia, in Rwanda, in Iraq, Afghanistan. These are areas where he developed an understanding of the level of international threat and the nature of that threat that will be invaluable on this committee. But I want to talk about the structure of the committee, because I think that's the point that is most important. New Zealanders want two things when it comes to security intelligence services. First of all, they want the certainty that they are safe, that they are secure, that they live in a society where the state can meet its fundamental obligations to its people, which is the right to life and the right to live free from fear of violence against them. But they also want something else. They want the certainty that when you give extraordinary powers to an agency like the SIS or the GCSB, and those extraordinary powers are exercised in secrecy, they want the confidence that there will be proper scrutiny and accountability over the exercise of those powers. There will not be abuse of those powers, and that not only the agencies themselves don't behave improperly and irresponsibly in regard to invasion of privacy, but the political masters of that agency also behave properly. And I had some personal experience where both the agencies and the political masters behaved improperly. That's not my prejudice against them. That was the finding of the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, where she said that the person that was in charge of the SIS behaved in a way that was unbalanced and lacked responsibility and was prejudiced. That's an appalling indictment on an official that I worked with over a 15-year period, sir. But it happened, and it's a recent example of why we need to make sure that these people are accountable. And you know, I concede immediately to the SIS that Rebecca Kitteridge came into my room and apologised for the appalling behaviour of her predecessor. I'm still waiting for the apology, Mr Speaker, from the person who allowed his political office to politicise the SIS through whale oil. But I won't be lying awake at night waiting for that apology, because to apologise for something you've got to be man enough to do so. Mr Speaker, I want to come to the structure of the Intelligence and Security Committee, because I don't believe that it's structured to do the job that we expect of it. This is a body that should be a safeguard against abuse of either political power or power by the agencies. But how can it possibly be a watchdog and a safeguard and all of the other things that Amy Adams said was important about it, when it is chaired by the very minister whose work it is overseeing? It's an absolute conflict of interest. Mr Key, or whoever is the minister at the time, is the minister that directs the SIS and the GCSB. The role of the committee should be to exercise oversight as to whether the minister is doing his job properly, and it is quite unacceptable and also unprecedented among other Western democracies to have the minister that should be being scrutinised chairing the committee. Now, I sat on that committee, Mr Chairman, so I know something about it. The power of the chair is to call the committee together. scarcely ever meets, Mr Chairman, scarcely ever meets, and it's entirely at the discretion of the Minister unless he has a particular role like the review, the financial review, and that's the only time actually the committee met. Not only does he call the committee together, he sets the agenda. So the Minister is scarcely going to set an agenda that puts himself under greater pressure. There is no other Western democracy that operates like that. Our mates across the Tasman, the Australians, don't do it. The Brits don't do it. The Americans don't do it. They have independent scrutiny over the actions of the security agencies, and that's what we should do as well. So my first point, Mr Speaker, is in setting the terms of reference for the review of the security agency, something that we've called for, and I think all of the parties have called for. There should be an input from every party in this House in setting the terms of reference. I mean, it is really important that we can develop a consensus around an issue like security agencies. That's the best protection against abuse of power. So I call on the ministers and the Prime Minister to allow all parties to have an input into those terms of reference. But specifically, Mr Speaker, I call on the Prime Minister to ensure that in those terms of reference, a full review and a restructuring of the Intelligence and the Security Committee takes place, because it's not doing the job that it should be doing, and it needs to change. It needs to change quite radically. I want to say one other thing, however, that I am pleased that the role of the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security as an independent watchdog has been borne out. And to give credit to Cheryl Gwynne as a person who has been able to act independently and neutrally. And I say it's really important that we have those safeguards to ensure that the SIS and the GCSB acts independently and neutrally. Because while I think they are both better organisations today, they have a history of not acting neutrally and impartially. You've only got to look at the track records of who they have spied upon over the years to see that they've been members, including members of this House or past members of this House, who are absolutely committed to democratic and peaceful ways of going about things, but who are subject to scrutiny. And the groups that are subject to scrutiny are groups that tend to be left of centre rather than right of centre. Now, I am one that believes that the intelligence agencies need to be absolutely politically neutral. That's what my real grievance was against the Prime Minister's politicising of it in terms of the leaking of the material to Cameron Slater. Mr Speaker, the second thing I want to say, it'll be the last thing I want to say, I guess, with the bell ringing, but when the new legislation comes in, I want to commend to Amy Adams and Chris Finlayson and John Key the role of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee as the appropriate committee to look at this. If we're examining the role of the Intelligence and Security Committee, it's better that another committee outside of that committee looks at it. And the Foreign Affairs Select Committee worked cooperatively and responsibly on the legislation we looked at last year. I had different views from Kennedy Graham and from Fletcher, but we worked cooperatively, we contained our differences, and we came out with some really good changes that particularly strengthened this legislation. And Labor and National worked quite responsibly across the House. So my call to the Prime Minister is, when the legislation is drafted, send that legislation to Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. It has the other advantage, Mr Speaker, that almost goes without saying, is that it's got broad membership on that committee. It's got all of the opposition parties on it. What we need as much as anything is the confidence of all sides of this House and all Kiwis that the powers that quite properly we give to intelligence agencies are properly safeguarded, are subject to proper scrutiny, and what better way to do that than to seek a genuine consensus about it by putting it before the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee. I commend that idea genuinely to the National Party. That's the best way this House as a whole will have confidence in the output of that legislation and the review that inspires it.
The Honourable Annette King.
Mr Speaker, it has been an interesting debate.
And I'd like to begin by saying to those